A few weeks ago, we held the first community game jam, a game development marathon where you get 1 week to make a game from scratch. And we were so overwhelmed with how many people participated in the jam. 6,800 people joined, and we got more than 1,100 submissions, which makes it the second biggest jam ever to be hosted on itch. So before we start going through the amazing entries, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone who participated in the jam and helped make it a success. Over the past few days, we've been playing a bunch of submissions and picked out some that we would like to show in this video. So without further ado, let's have a look at some of my favorite games from the community game jam, in no particular order. But first, this video is sponsored by Ludic. Ludic are the creators of the well-known visual scripting solution Bolt, and they've just launched a completely new Unity workflow tool called Peak. Peak comes with a bunch of features like toolbars that will let you inspect game objects, components, and materials outside the inspector, and a creator which quickly lets you create new game objects directly in your scene view. Peak makes especially level design a lot easier, it speeds up your process and ensures a clean editor through a focused workflow. Overall, it will make your game dev life a lot easier and it just feels like a natural part of Unity. So if you're interested in improving your Unity workflow, I definitely recommend you check it out. To get started, simply click the link in the description. So the theme for the jam was "The Game is a Liar." And I think it's amazing how many different games you guys managed to come up with around this theme. Take for example the incredibly fun and equally frustrating game, The Tutorial. In this game, the player must complete a bunch of tutorial levels without exactly being sure which parts of the instructions to trust and which not to. This leads to some really fun and surprising events and definitely forced me to overcome my desire to push large and shiny buttons. At least on the second attempt. It's also really hard, which makes the lack of checkpoints pretty brutal. This game definitely reminded me of my own entry, Detective Truth, in that it pretends to be a normal puzzle platformer, but then surprises the player by having seemingly harmless gameplay elements kill without warning. In fact, I think this was a fairly common interpretation of the theme. Take for example, games don't lie. When the creator of this game tells you that this game doesn't lie, that is definitely a lie in itself. Being probably one of the most frustrating games I've played for this jam, I now understand why people in the comments section talked about rage quitting. It's definitely also a game that puts your memory to work, as you have to remember the right path, where there are spikes laid out, what's really there and what isn't. It's also a really well-paced game because it adds slower storytelling parts in between every chapter. Since the story itself is fun, this has sort of a calming effect that makes you cool down before inevitably getting very mad again. And talking about story, a game that I really like is A Normal Dungeon. In this game, you set out as a knight in shining armor to slay the horrible beast that dwells within the deep, dark dungeon. On the way, you meet an old man that tells you that many knights have attempted this before you and none have returned. The graphics and level design both work really well, however the best thing is definitely the ending. See, after having fought through this dungeon, and of course died a bunch of times, you come upon the beast's lair. Here, corpses of knights are strewn about, and standing over them is dum dum dum, another knight. So you condemn him as a monster and fight him. However, as soon as you manage to kill him, another knight comes along, sees you standing on top of this pile of corpses, condemns you as a monster and kills you. Great and effective writing and a nice way to wrap up the story. And staying in the realm of Dungeons and Deception is a wonderfully different take on the theme. It's a psychological card game where you use cards such as Insult that damages the enemy or Keep It Inside that fortifies yourself in order to fight your way through a dungeon. The cool thing is that you need to think about how you combine these cards with lie cards to make the most of them. The only problem is that lies damage both you and the enemy, so you have to be careful when to lie and when not to. Plus there are just a lot of cool cards that can be uncovered as you progress, such as Let It All Out that damages enemies based on how much you've used Keep It Inside, and Spread that makes copies of a lie. I personally really enjoyed this one, and it had me go, "Ooh, cool," every time I discovered a new card. Now, one of the most innovative games that I played was Key Defense. This is a tower defense game, but not in the usual way. Instead of placing towers, the player has to create a path for the enemies to travel to make sure that the towers in that level can reach and kill them before they get to the end. Combine this with the genius idea of using a keyboard as the grid for the levels, and you have a really unique experience. Plus, I think it was surprisingly satisfying to sculpt paths by clicking the right sequence of buttons on the keyboard. Of course, my keyboard is based on the Danish alphabet, so there was a bit of guesswork involved to figure out which keys map to what in the game. Of course, I later figured out that you could just use the mouse. Oh well. Also, the best pun award for the first community game jam goes to Liar. Because never trust a small harp, they often turn out to be liars. Gets me every time. In fact, I think something a lot of the games did really well was the use of humor. Most of the time it was the incredibly cheeky and frustrating type of humor, such as when I sat down to play a track of lies. I was really getting ready to race, and I even picked out a car just to find out that it was all made up and it was another platformer game. And yes, yet another frustrating one. Another game that had me laughing was Funfair. Unfair. Funfair. Of course, it was a must-play, as puns are pretty popular here amongst the Brackeys team. In this management game, you have to build fair stands that you can choose to rig in order to scam your park visitors for more money. This, however, makes the customers mad, and you have to constantly get rid of complaining customers by either using the baseball bat or by hiring a bouncer. The best part of this game is definitely the wonderful ways that you can rig your games, by for example replacing the tip of the arrows at the balloon stand with suction cups. And as you can see, I ended up spending probably a bit too much time on this one. Next up we have Roundo Emporium, a game where you play as a new store owner that has to deliver the right products to customers, but your deceitful robot pal Roberto keeps giving you wrong instructions. See, Roberto believes machines should run the shop alone, and so he's constantly trying to sabotage you. This makes for a really fun game where you always have to fetch a product that has none of the characteristics described by Roberto. It's simple, stressful, and the graphics are really cute. Overall, it's just a game that doesn't try to do too much, and because of that, it excels at being what it is. Now, one game that I just can't wait to talk about is Clickhead. This game completely blew me away. At first you're presented with a menu. As you try clicking the buttons, however, they break and a text box appears. At this point you realize that the menu has totally different plans with you. It starts talking about how you were probably expecting a game here, but there is none. And for a moment you think, well, I guess this is it. However, the menu gets bored and decides to spawn in a player. And this is when things start to take off, because the menu finds out that the game is bugged. The player can move outside the menu screen, and what follows is an amazingly original and well thought out platformer that takes place inside a virus-infested menu. The player must use the different menu buttons to complete puzzles, and also has to use the mouse as part of the platforming. In fact, you come upon buttons that are so bugged out that the mouse cannot travel through them, which makes for some really interesting gameplay. All in all, I cannot say enough good things about Clickhead, including the wonderful ending. And talking about crazy menus, another game that embraces the totally chaotic is All Is Chaos in Love and War. This game is complete madness from the very beginning, having the very menu itself be a challenge to get through. After getting into the game, you are then presented with 4 different class choices, none of which are what they seem. The game also has a shop where you can purchase items. Of course, you can't trust anything from price to stat bonuses, so you have to play several times to figure out what works and what doesn't. Overall, a really fun experience. And last but certainly not least, I have to mention Brackeys. It's not only a weird experience to play as a cyborg version of yourself, it's also an incredibly fun, fast-paced shooter. And also, do I look like a supervillain to you guys? Cause I'm kind of noticing a trend. Is it a vibe that I'm giving off? Weird. And that's pretty much all the games we have time to cover in this video. Of course, there's so many amazing games that we haven't talked about, so I definitely encourage you to go play them yourself. There's of course a link to all of them in the description. Finally, I would just like to thank AquaXV, Blackthorn Prod, Codemist, Danny, Jabrils, Job, Saiku, Jillian, and the Dutch Magikarp for organizing this amazing event. And thanks to all of the participants for making it awesome. Also, don't forget to check out Peak and make your game dev life a lot easier and more fun. Simply click the link in the description to get started. On that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks to all of the awesome Patreon supporters who donated in August, and a special thanks to Infinity PPR, Dennis Sullivan, Lost to Violence, Love Forever, Chris, Faisal Marify, Leo Lissette, David Lipka, Runin, Daniel Desanic, Jacob Sanford, Naoki Wasaki, Gregory Pierce, Daryl Soniga, The Mighty Zeus, Edison the Fierce, and Erasmus. You guys rock!